If you will, cast your minds back, further back for some of us than others, to a time when you were very young. I'm thinking 3 or 4 years old. Don't have too many memories of those days, but I do have a few, and one of the memories of that time is this thought of what lurked under the bed. In my 3 or 4 year old mind, I thought if I was away from the edge of the bed and covered with the covers, the monster that lived under the bed couldn't get me. Now, on occasion, I would, during the day, I would look under the bed, and it was clear there was nothing there. And I thought, oh, it's silly. There's nothing that lives under my bed. But something in the back of my mind, lurking there, suggested that if I had my hand hanging over, if I had my foot hanging over just a little bit, the monster could reach up from under the bed and pull me off or get me. So before I went to sleep each night, I had to make sure that my hand was inside the bed and my feet were inside the bed. So just in case the monster under the bed couldn't get me. It's funny the tricks that our minds play. Things that we can't see, the things that are in darkness, can worry us and bother us and trouble us. As I got a little older, one of the things that I really loved doing was running through the woods. And if you've been to my parents' house, you've seen all the trees out there. And not only do they have trees, but when I was growing up, the farms had lots of trees on them. There's a county wildlife park just up the road. It's covered in trees and fields. And so one of the things I loved to do was to run through the woods and just explore the whole landscape in that area. What I found out is that it all changed as it got dark. And so I used to enjoy not only running through the woods in the day, but even at night I would like to go and see what was out there in the dark. And if there was a nice full moon, if the stars were shining, you could go almost anywhere after dark. But I remember this point where I had to decide whether I was going to give in to the fears of what might be out there in the dark. Were there coyotes? Were there raccoons? Was there something more awful out there? And so I remember that moment saying, there's nothing out there at night that's not out there during the day. So you can go out there and explore the woods at night. But every once in a while, as I was running through the trees and down the paths and across the fields, I would just get this feeling like, maybe there's something different lurking in the darkness. As I grew up, I realized that there are things lurking in the darkness. Not that I imagined when I was a kid, but in certain places, in certain situations, there are things lurking in the darkness. Back early in my ministry, I served down in Joplin, and one of the things I did was serve as a part-time police chaplain, and so part of my responsibility was riding along with police officers. And so I think it was the second or third ride-along that I was on that there was someone suspected of breaking into a house. Another officer had pulled over this truck, and we were going to meet them to provide backup. Just as we pulled up, the people in the truck scattered. They were running. And only one person out of that vehicle stayed. So the police officers who were there chased the ones that ran off into the darkness. And I was left with this one person from this suspect vehicle. And he was kind of looking around and looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, now what do I do if he takes off and runs? Do I just let him go? Do I try to tackle him? What do I do? Thankfully, he didn't do anything, and we just stayed there and talked until the officers that had chased the others into the darkness brought them back handcuffed. And I thought after that how brave they were to run into the darkness after these people who were suspected of breaking into people's house, not knowing what they were going to do, not knowing where they were going to end up, not knowing what they were going to run into, to grab them and to bring them back to arrest them. So sometimes there is danger in the darkness. Over the last couple of weeks, I've talked about the author of 1 John, and let me say a little more about that just so you know why I'm saying the author and not John. There is a relationship and connection between the Gospel of John, the 3 epistles of John, and Revelation. There are similar themes in all of them. Light is a big theme. Love is a big theme. Jesus being the Messiah is a big theme. Sin and forgiveness is a big theme. And so you can find those in all of those writings. But the language in them is often very different. The language in the Gospel of John is different than in the epistles, and the language in the epistles is very different from Revelation, as you know. There's a lot of symbolic language, and so there are many differences. So scholars speculate, nobody really knows, that perhaps different people or a different person wrote the Epistle of John than the Gospel of John. Traditionally, it's all been assigned to the disciple. But scholars see that the things addressed in the Epistles of John and Revelation were a different situation in the world than what was happening in the Gospel. And so they wonder, perhaps it was another person named John, perhaps it was a follower who wrote it in honor and in name of John. Whoever it was, the author, John, is writing to encourage fellow Christians. And the situation in those churches is not dissimilar to what we're going through today, because as humans, our nature doesn't change very much. And so we repeat the same patterns over and over again. To the people that John was addressing, they were having conflict with some of the Jews, because some of the Jews believed, but many more did not, and they were unhappy that the Christians were not obeying all the laws of Moses. In fact, many of them said, well, you don't have to follow that if you just have faith in Jesus. Well, as you can imagine, that didn't set well with the Jews, who thought you should follow all the festivals, all the rules, all the traditions of the Jewish faith. And so some of them went about trying to discredit the Christians. Some of them even went so far as trying to destroy some of the Christian groups and communities that had sprung up. In addition to that, there was some animosity and conflict between the pagans and the Christians, because the Christians were devoted to Jesus and to no other gods, to no other faiths. And so their sole attention on Christ put them at odds with those who thought, well, you can worship any god that you want to. You can worship Zeus, or you can worship Mars, or you can, mix and match. You can have a few Greek gods and a few Roman gods and a few Egyptian gods, and hey, it's all good as long as you worship somebody, because that was part of their life together, their community life. They would have festivals celebrating various pagan gods. But the Christians would not participate. They would not be a part of this part of the community life. And so they were viewed with suspicion. It was a little bit like the controversy over whether or not to stand or to kneel during the national anthem. Those pagans thought the Christians were unpatriotic. Well, they're not upholding their civic duty. They're not being a part of the Roman Empire. And so there was that sort of feeling between the Christians and the pagans. And just like some are calling for a boycott of the NFL, there was an economic dimension to this controversy. As the Christians said, well, pagan gods don't really exist. They're just figments of imagination. They have no power whatsoever. Well, the Christians wouldn't visit the shrines and the temples, and they would encourage their friends and family and anyone they met not to go and patronize the temples and the shrines. And so the people who ran the temples and shrines were feeling the economic impact. And on several occasions, you can read about this in Paul in Acts, they wanted to imprison those who were stopping the pagans and shrines from operating smoothly and profitably. So there was all this conflict, all this situation where people were finding divisions and seeing threats here and there. So just like in much of our world today, there was distrust, there were people attacking others, there were those who were stirring up and promoting hatred. So the message that John is giving to his readers back then is a profound message for our day, for our world today. As I was growing up, I had relatives that had lived through World War II, and so I sort of overheard some of their discussions. As I went through school, of course, that was covered in history, and you could identify one or two main enemies, right? It was the Germans and the Japanese. Pretty narrow category of enemy. And then as the Cold War came along, it was the Soviet Union and maybe Cuba, so still fairly narrow. And then there was North Vietnam and the communists. And but today it seems like there's so many enemies. I mean, where do you stop? The Russians influenced our election, and there's North Korea. That's a constant worry. And I guess Saudi Arabia had a missile come in, and they suspect Iran was behind it. So Iran's one of the perhaps enemies. And there's the Taliban, and some of our soldiers got killed in Niger, and we apparently had an air strike in Somalia. Wow, how many enemies are out there? It just seems like we're surrounded with enemies, right? And that's not to mention the domestic conflict, liberals and conservatives, and there's those who are trying to divide us by race and nationality and economic class, and a lot of people looking out there. Those people are different. They don't believe what we do. So what does John have to say about situations like that? According to John, the thing that lurks in the dark is hatred. And he uses light to connect to love. If you read through the whole epistle, which is not very long, just 5 chapters, love and light are equated. If you're loving people, as Kayla read, you're walking in the light. If you're hating people, you're walking in the darkness. It's that straightforward. He uses light to symbolize love. Love of God, love of Christ, love of individual people for others. If you're loving people, you're in the light. If you hate people, then you are lurking in the darkness. And just to give you a little flavor of what he talks about in love, we could have easily done this series using 1 John and had the theme be love as light. He uses the two almost interchangeably in different places. So if you grab your pew Bible or any other Bible that you've got there, and this is just a little bit later than the part that Kayla read, where she talks about if you love your brother, you're in the light. If you hate your brother, you're in the darkness. What John talks about, as Jesus did, was he equates hatred with murder. If you hate someone, it's the same as being guilty of murder. And so he mentions that, and then he talks about love and how to put love into action. If you'll turn to 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. And that's on page 1209. It's really close to the back of the Bible. 1209. Again, it's 1 John chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. So let me read to you what John says. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. If anyone has material possessions and see his brother in need, but has no pity on him, how can the love of God be in him? Dear children, let us not love with words or tongue, but with actions and in truth. So this light, so this love has practical application. It puts us into action. One of the qualities of light, we've talked about so many over the last couple of weeks, one of the quality of light is that it shines. The more we love, the brighter we shine as Christ's followers. And so that's what John is trying to get these Christians to see. If they harbor some resentment, if they have some hatred, then they have not fully stepped into the light. They are lurking in the darkness because it is hate that lurks in the darkness. It is only when we love and put that love into action that we are fully in the light. And so he pleads, he encourages, he proclaims to his readers, walk in the light. Be the light. Let there be light. So that the love of Christ can be shared not just among Christian followers, but all those in the community, all those across the world. Because he holds up the vision, the light, that the world would be a better place if people worked together, if people loved one another, if people shared, if people helped one another, rather than all the division and all the conflict that was present in their world, and of course is present in ours. So he tells us, walk in the light, be the light, share the light, let there be light, which is the love of Christ. Let us be those people that share the light and love of Christ with others. Let us pray. Father, in this moment, we lift up to you our world. We lift up our community. We even lift up ourselves, Lord, because we know there is darkness in our lives. There are times when we don't love as we should. There are times when we haven't been the people we should be. But we ask through your Spirit that you would strengthen us, that you would let that light shine in our hearts. Help us to share the love of Christ with those around us, with our church and our community. And help us not only to speak the words of love, but to act on those words, to help others, to lift them up, to make their lives better than they were. Let us be your people of light. This we ask in the name of Christ.